Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to reply to the budget speech that we heard this week and that we reviewed. So where do you start, Mr. Speaker? Well, I start by evaluating the adequacy of this budget based on the kinds of needs that my constituents bring to me, the needs of New Brunswickers that people tell me about as I tour the province around access to health care, access to livable income, affordable homes, food security, a stable climate and a livable future for the children, and healthy ecosystems in our forests and waterways. Monsieur le Président, les gens du Nouveau-Brunswick méritent un gouvernement qui est honnête avec eux. Budget après budget, le gouvernement a considérablement sous-estimé les revenus attendus, privant les services publics d'investissement dont ils ont grandement besoin. En conséquence, nous avons vu des accidents massifs remis aux banquiers, tandis que les Néo-Brunswickois ont perdu la vie dans nos salles d'attente des urgences. This is precisely what happens, Mr. Speaker, when governments fail to put the well-being of New Brunswickers at the heart of their budget. As a result, we get budgets that trample on the limits of what people can endure and trample on the limits of what the environment can sustain. Mr. Speaker, people are struggling and our environment is unraveling. Let's start with health care. Is this budget going to make a difference? Our ERs are intended to provide emergency medicine to people who have suffered heart attacks, strokes, or physical trauma for car crashes. But they're jammed with people who need access to a family doctor or nurse practitioner. Either they have no health care provider or they can't access their health care provider in a timely manner. So they have to visit the ER if they want personal, face-to-face, hands-on examination. Cette situation a repoussé les limites de ce que les gens peuvent endurer, à savoir attendre 14 heures ou plus aux urgences. Les gens abandonnent, rentrent chez eux et deviennent encore plus malades. D'autres décident de rester chez eux, de chercher leurs symptômes sur Google ou d'appeler le 811 pour savoir combien de temps ils doivent attendre avant de devoir absolument se rendre aux urgences. Mr. Speaker, people need an alternative to the ER. Ça ne prend pas la tête à Papineau pour comprendre ça. This budget should ensure there is an alternative in place. Where do you go when you actually need to see a doctor or a nurse practitioner rather than the ER? If you can't see your own doctor or you don't have one or you don't have a nurse practitioner. We need urgent care clinics in our hospitals and community health centers to solve this problem so New Brunswickers can access primary health care in a timely manner. This has been proposed countless times by physicians, by nurse practitioners, by heads of our ERs, and yet we haven't seen any fundamental movement on this. It will cost money, yes, but it's an investment in our people, Mr. Speaker, an investment. In terms of access to primary health care, Mr. Speaker, Liberals and Conservatives have been taking turns singing the praises of collaborative health care teams as a means to solve doctor shortages since when, Mr. Speaker? 2002. 2002. We've been talking about this. Yet neither has done anything substantive to transition primary health care services to collaborative care teams. This budget should achieve that, but it doesn't. Promises that collaborative care teams will solve the doctor shortage go back to Health Ministers Alvin Robichaud and Brad Green under Bernard Lord, Mike Murphy and Mary Schreier under Sean Graham, Madeleine Dubé and Ted Fleming under David Allward, Victor Boudreau and Benoit Bourque under Brian Gallant, Ted Fleming again under Premier Higgs, Dorothy Shepherd and Bruce Fitch under Premier Higgs. Mr. Speaker, that's 4 Liberal health ministers and 6 Tory ministers that have failed to deliver on the promise of collaborative health teams since 2002. The current minister is still talking about it, yet there appears to be nothing in this budget to truly make it a reality. You know, 8 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals promised to take 2,000 New Brunswickers off the waiting list for a doctor by creating a pilot project to have nurse practitioners working with family physicians. It was called the Enhanced Patient Access Primary Care Pilot Project. Nothing, absolutely nothing, ever came of it. Yet the waiting list for healthcare providers grew and grew and grew. Healthcare reform has become a process of perpetual pilot projects, Mr. Speaker, that get us absolutely nowhere. Where's the accountability, Mr. Speaker? Where is the accountability? Les équipes collaboratives de soins de santé augmenteront considérablement le nombre de personnes bénéficiant de fournisseurs de soins de santé, mais elles nécessitent un investissement financier dans la fourniture de soins de santé primaires. For example, fundamental, if there's one thing that this government could do through this budget, is to create a different funding model for nurse practitioners so they can actually work in collaborative healthcare teams, Mr. Speaker, so they can be reimbursed directly for their work. With the status quo, the family doctor must pay the wages of collaborating nurse practitioners from the income they receive from Medicare for their services as physicians. It's not sustainable. Or somehow they must convince the RHAs to put the nurse practitioners on payroll in the collaborative practice. This is the same situation for other health professionals, from dietitians to physiotherapists, except for pharmacists, Mr. Speaker. Government is now reimbursing pharmacists directly for the kind of work they do to diagnose and treat minor matters, minor illnesses. Not minor to the person who's suffering from them at the point, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, minor or manageable. So, Mr. Speaker, this budget needs to create a funding formula that ensures nurse practitioners and other allied health professionals can join family physicians in collaborative care teams to serve those currently without a primary health care provider. It really is the key, Mr. Speaker, that will unlock the development of, in the transition to primary collaborative care teams that will dominate, and solo physicians, healthcare providers will become much more in the minority. That's where we need to get to, Mr. Speaker, but this budget does not seem to address that fundamental need to provide an alternative funding model for nurse practitioners, Madam Speaker. Un budget axé sur le bien-être des gens du Nouveau-Brunswick garantirait que tout le monde ait des fournisseurs de soins de santé primaires et puisse avoir accès à des soins urgents en cas de besoin. Madam Speaker, a budget focused on the well-being of New Brunswickers would also have well-funded public health care to reduce the number of sick people in the system who are in need of diagnoses and treatment and rehabilitation, Madam Speaker. I don't see anything in this budget that makes preventative health care a priority. Part of our challenge is the number of sick people we have. And there is so much that can be done to help bring about a healthier population, and there's so little that actually can be done for lack of budgetary resources. Think about, I'll give you a list, Madam Speaker, sexual health, maternal and infant health. Where, Madam Speaker, if we rolled out midwives from the small practice that currently Horizon operates in Fredericton across the province, particularly in rural New Brunswick, what a contribution to improving maternal and infant health with midwives available across this province, Madam Speaker, because of the prenatal and postnatal care they provide. I have had letter after letter from people who have been cared for by the midwives in Fredericton who sing their praises. You wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it, the kind of care and attention and good outcomes Madam Speaker, that they provide. But let me continue the list. Let me continue the list. So sexual health, maternal infant health, healthy eating, alcohol consumption, drug use, physical activity, radon gas in our homes, Madam Speaker. It's the second largest cause of cancers in this province, and yet we have no program to ensure that people understand the threat, that it's 1 or 4 out of 4 or 5 homes that have unsafe levels of radon gas in their homes. There is no money to help people remediate that radon gas because you're into the thousands of dollars to remediate it. Nothing. So monitoring and remediation of that's key. Avoiding environmental carcinogens and neurotoxins, pesticides and air pollution. The list goes on, Madam Speaker, when it comes to preventing the need for health care services through preventative health care measures. None of these appear in this budget. You know, Madam Speaker, when it comes to public health, which is really the body that is responsible for delivering all this, their capacity is badly broken. It started when the Liberals broke up public health after firing former Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. ÉLUS Cleary. Then they sent the Population Health Unit to Social Development. They sent the Healthy Environment Unit to the Environment Department, and the public health inspectors to Public Safety, badly compromising the ability of public health to carry out its mandate for preventative health care. And now, Madam Speaker, this government has failed to put it back together. While this government hasn't fired any medical officers of health, 2 regional medical officers of health and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Health stepped down and left the province under this Premier. Why? Were there exit interviews? What brought that about? Inquiring minds want to know, Madam Speaker. Meanwhile, in this state, over the past year, public health has withdrawn from the public sphere and appears to be struggling to carry out its full mandate on behalf of New Brunswickers. Madame la Présidente, cela fait des années que la protection de l'environnement n'a pas bénéficié d'un financement accru. En l'absence de financement adéquat, nous avons constaté que la protection de l'environnement n'était pas assurée. Résultat, nous avons piétiné les limites de ce que la nature peut supporter. Let me list a few examples of how we've been trampling on the limits that the ecosystems and the environment can sustain. In New Brunswick, dead zones in our coastal bays. Dead zones, right here in New Brunswick, in our coastal bays, all up and down the Acadian shore. Sedimentation in our rivers. How are salmon supposed to spawn, Madam Speaker, and successfully spawn when our river bottoms are sedimented the way they are? No freshwater quality standards for our waterways. Degradation of the biological diversity of our forest ecosystems. The unregulated release of PFAS, forever chemicals, into our environment. And once again, we're seeing the importation of sewage sludge from Maine, worried about PFAS chemicals, so they brought in regulations to help protect their citizens, their environment, their farmers from the contamination in that sewage sludge, and we're bringing it into New Brunswick. Who permitted that? Who licensed that? Where's the accountability, Madam Speaker? Continuing the list, blue-green algal blooms and the neurotoxins that creates, Madam Speaker, the neurotoxins that pose a significant risk to people and wildlife. Continued aerial spraying of glyphosate and use of widespread use of other sorts of pesticides that are problematic, and of course the destabilization of our climate. That's what happens, Madam Speaker, when you don't make this a priority. The failure to protect the environment means urgent action is needed to reduce the pressure on nature so that that which has been degraded can be restored. And systems like the climate, which have been destabilized, can be made stable again. I don't see that commitment in this budget, Madam Speaker. Let's take climate action, for example. The burning of fossil fuels grew far beyond what the environment could sustain. The sheer scale of the resulting carbon pollution has overwhelmed our atmosphere, giving us global heating, and overwhelmed the capacity of the oceans to absorb that carbon, causing ocean acidification. I thought I'd never see that. We stopped acid rain in this province and in eastern Canada. They say it couldn't be done, Madam Speaker, but we stopped acid rain. In New Brunswick, which was a laggard, became a leader in doing so, Madam Speaker. The first province to put scrubbers on its power plants in this country. Now we've got acidification of our oceans right here off our coasts, in the Northumberland Straits, in the Bay of Chaleur, in the Bay of Fundy. Measurable acidification because of all the fossil fuel burning that's going on and the carbon pollution that's being released. On Monday, the scientists of the UN's International Panel on Climate Change chillingly, Madam Speaker, released their final warning. Their words, not mine. They said the window is rapidly closing to secure a livable future for us all. And why the heck? This government has no sense of urgency about this. When we're talking about the livable future for our children, Madam Speaker, this week outside at the climate change rally, the students from St. Thomas University organized. There was a speaker who said she had made that choice not to have children because she is worried about the kind of future that they would be growing up in. Unlivable. That's where we've got to. What do we do, Madam Speaker, to curtail our use of fossil fuels in the next few years will determine our fate and the fate of the people on this earth. We can still avoid, Madam Speaker, the worst of the climate crisis, as the IPCC scientists said, but it requires genuine change now, and that means making deep cuts in fossil fuel use now and rapidly. If we have any hope of restabilizing the climate and halting the acidification of our ocean waters, we have got to severely curtail our use of fossil fuels now. Driving, Madam Speaker. We need to get around. We need to go places. There is virtually no accessible, effective, and convenient alternative to driving in this province. If we're going to curtail our use of fossil fuels, we need alternatives to driving. We need a rail system linking the city of St. John, the city of Fredericton, the city of Moncton, and the north to the south. A rail system that actually works north to south, where you have trains regularly on a daily basis running on tracks that are safe so that the trains don't have to crawl forward about the speed of a snail because any faster, and it would be unsafe because the tracks are not well maintained. It needs investment, Madam Speaker. It needs investment. A bus system, Madam Speaker, that actually works for the people of this province wherever they live. From Campbellton to Caraquet, Campobello, well, they need a ferry to link to the bus as well, I might add, to Sackville. So that's what we need, Madam Speaker. Cela signifie qu'il faut moins conduire. Cependant, ce budget ne prévoit une fois de plus aucun investissement dans la construction d'un système de transport public provincial qui permettrait aux gens de conduire moins. Il ne prévoit pas non plus d'investissement dans des infrastructures de transport actives, telles que des voies piétons au-dessus des autoroutes très fréquentées, qui permettraient de réduire la conduite dans nos villes. Curtailing our use of fossil fuels also means reducing the demand for energy to heat our homes. But the budget has failed to substantially increase support for energy efficiency in our homes or businesses, nor provide any increased funding for installing heat pumps. There's around, Madam Speaker, 50,000 low-income homeowners in New Brunswick. What percentage of households does this budget want to see upgraded with insulation and conversion to heat pumps? Madam Speaker, it's such a small number, I can't see it from this side of the House. At this rate, it's going to take more than a decade to ensure that low-income households and homeowners are upgraded and outfitted with heat pumps to protect them from ever-increasing energy costs, Madam Speaker, mostly resulting from New Brunswick's dependence on Point Lepreau nuclear power plant because of the high costs of that sort of energy and technology. And Madam Speaker, that program that is being operated at a very slow pace doesn't contemplate how to assist low-income tenants of our province. There's no programs in this budget to help landlords upgrade the insulation and heating systems of their properties. Tenants have no control over their heating systems, no control over the insulation in their walls, or the quality of the windows in their apartments at all. So, without such a program to encourage and incentivize landlords to upgrade their properties, to reduce their demand for energy, to make their apartments more comfortable and less costly to heat, essentially we're sentencing tenants to a life of unaffordable heating costs. Now, maybe the government side in this House doesn't care about that, because they don't seem to care about rising unaffordable rental costs, and apparently they don't seem to care about rising unaffordable heating costs for tenants. I can't tell you, Madam Speaker, how many students and other constituents who have called me and said they can't afford their heating costs, they can't stay in their apartment, they can just barely afford the rent, add expensive heating costs onto that, and they are in trouble. J'ai des électeurs qui ont quitté leur logement parce que les coûts de chauffage étaient si élevés qu'ils ne pouvaient plus payer au loyer pourtant abordable. And then what about substituting renewable energy sources for fossil fuels, Madam Speaker? St. John Energy is about to open a 42-megawatt wind farm with battery storage. With battery storage, Madam Speaker, storage to contain the electricity when the winds are not cooperating. This budget contains no target for growing our use of renewable sources of energy and storage technologies at all. Nothing. The target, there's no target. There's no commitment. I don't know where we're headed. This budget doesn't even increase the budget of the Climate Change Secretariat, those long-suffering public servants who are charged with overseeing the implementation of this government's climate action plan. It's not going to be done in time. The supply of food we import, Madam Speaker, is becoming increasingly insecure because of the breakdown in our climate. You can't grow food in a drought situation. You can't grow food when you're flooded out. And we're seeing in those regions of the world where we import much of our food from long-term, multi-year, punishing droughts. We have to make the decision that we will develop the capacity to feed ourselves in this region. But does this budget say anything about increasing food self-sufficiency, moving us down that road to food self-sufficiency in this province? No, it does not. The emphasis in agricultural policy of this government remains on expanding the production of our farmland to grow the exports of agricultural commodities, cash crops, rather than feeding ourselves. This entrenches long supply lines, which not only puts food security at risk, but anchors us to the fossil fuels to transport our food supply over long distances. The shorter our supply lines for the food we need, the more we curtail the use of fossil fuels to import essentials like food. And, Madam Speaker, it's not only our dependence on fossil fuels, it's trampling on the limits of what the environment can sustain and on the limits of what people can endure. The degradation of our forest ecosystems continues apace as we careen towards species extinction and ecosystem collapse. The Department of Natural Resources doesn't even know what shrubs and plants inhabit the forest blocks that they permit the big forest companies to clear-cut and then convert them to softwood plantations. They have no clue. How are you supposed to conserve biodiversity when you don't know what you've got until it's gone, as Joni Mitchell once sang? It's why a dozen forest ecosystem types in New Brunswick are now officially at risk of vanishing from the face of the earth. This budget is silent on responding to the biodiversity crisis. You could say it's a silent spring this year all over again, Madam Speaker. I want to talk about housing. Un gouvernement axé sur le mieux-être des gens du Nouveau-Brunswick veillerait à ce que tout le monde ait un endroit sûr et abordable à appeler chez soi. The decision has been taken to resuscitate the New Brunswick Housing Corporation to provide the institutional capacity to deliver an adequate supply of affordable housing. And I congratulate the Minister of Housing for ensuring that came about, because, Madam Speaker, without the institutional capacity to deliver affordable housing, it doesn't happen. We've seen that. So now the institutional capacity is being built. We all hope adequately. It's hard to tell whether the budget is sufficient, but we'll get into that at estimates, because it does need to have the capacity, once it's up and running, to deliver an adequate supply of affordable housing. So the staffing needs to include subject matter experts. New hires, is the budget sufficient to do that? It's yet unclear. It needs to ensure adequate financing is available to create the kind of boom in the construction and renovation of affordable housing that we need, of non-market housing, Madam Speaker. Is there sufficient funds there to do that? It's unclear. Details are not clear, and we'll be asking about that. I recently was speaking to a non-profit property developer who's building affordable housing in New Brunswick. He's got units going up in Memramcook and coming in Woodstock. He said one of the most important things the government can do to facilitate construction of affordable apartments, actually, it was a surprise to me, and I hope the Minister of Finance takes this to heart, Minister of Treasury Board, responsible for Treasury Board. He said one of the most important things that government can do to remove barriers to the development of more affordable housing in this province is to institute the capacity to fast-track already approved financing for those construction projects. I was surprised, and that's why it's always so important to talk to the people on the ground. I assumed maybe it was the difficulty in assessing financial support from the provincial government, the federal government, putting that together to make sure that the business case all works to build affordable housing, non-market housing. But no, it was actually a cash flow issue, Madam Speaker, that I know the minister responsible for the Treasury Board has the ability to fix. So, wow. What a great thing to know, and what a great opportunity to remove that barrier, non-budgetary barrier, to accelerating the construction of affordable non-market housing in the province. I can appreciate, Madam Speaker, the difficulties. I mean, if you're burning through cash in the middle of a building project, tens of thousands of dollars a day at some points, and part of the cash you need that was already secured but isn't showing up in a timely manner, becomes a disincentive for nonprofit developers to enter the market. It's important when it comes to housing, Madam Speaker, too, that we have targeted strategies to meet various housing needs, because I know the Minister of Housing likes to talk about the housing continuum, and in a sense that is the right when you break it out. So those with intellectual disabilities need supportive housing, and those in the NGOs, in the community, people who've been working with and trying to and successfully advocating for the kinds of supports those with intellectual disabilities require, have made this point over and over and over again, particularly as parents age and their adult children no longer can count on their parents for support. There needs to be targeted, specific and specialized supportive housing. Take people with mental illness and addictions. Also need specialized supportive housing, Madam Speaker, which we don't have. Seniors need more options, Madam Speaker. I don't know how many times I've heard from seniors that they've been looking in different parts of this province for something else beyond a nursing home or a special care home, that they could continue to maintain some of their autonomy but receive the kind of minimal support that they require. But living with others Madam Speaker, so they're not in isolation, but are in social situations when they choose. You can think of newcomers, Madam Speaker, with large families, very special housing needs, and students who, of course, need housing and have difficulty finding it in many parts of the province. La Société d'habitation du Nouveau-Brunswick, qui a été relancée à du pain sur la planche, c'est pourquoi elle a besoin de budget pour réaliser son plein potentiel en assurant une offre adéquate de logements abordables qui répond aux besoins de tous et toutes. Madam Speaker, as I was preparing the speech, I got a call from a single parent with a daughter, a young daughter, whose power had been turned off by NB Power. Not a power failure, but failure to pay the bills. Madam Speaker, he gets paid next week. He couldn't make his income stretch far enough to cover the power bills in a timely manner. Now, as MLAs, we know we can help, and we know we can help negotiate an arrangement between NB Power and the constituent to get the power turned back on and a repayment plan put in place that can be afforded. But it speaks, Madam Speaker, to the need for a livable income in this province. Because when you can't afford your rent and your power bills and your heat, you don't have a livable income. So we need to look at a livable income. The outreach workers in my riding are telling me they're seeing people who were housed and are now on the street because of unaffordable rent increases. And if you wander around downtown Moncton or downtown Fredericton, St. John, and increasingly in our towns, as villages as well, you will see the growing number of people who are homeless. It's unconscionable in these economic times when the affordability crisis is affecting so many people that the rent cap has not been reinstituted. People are ending up on the street, they're telling me, because of unaffordable rent increases. That can be fixed. It can be so easily fixed, and we need to do it in this legislature. I was, Madam Speaker, both disappointed and shocked that this budget did nothing to increase the income for those on social assistance. Yes, the automatic inflation adjustment is there, but that's automatic. That's not something that needed to be put in the budget. The income remains impossible to live on. We all know income assistance rates are at a level that is impossible for people to meet their basic needs. So again, without an increase in social assistance rates, we're going to see not only more people on the street, but we're going to see a steep rise in people living in deep poverty, including those with disabilities who have no possibility, no matter what assistance might be provided, of ever working. So it leads me to a simple question, Madam Speaker. Why, once again, are the poor being punished for their poverty? Because that's what it feels like, Madam Speaker. Why are the disabled being punished for the disabilities? We've seen massive surpluses. The last 2 years, something on the level of $2 billion in surpluses, money that could have been spent to ease their pain, to ease their suffering, to help them meet their basic needs. But no, never happened. Les gens seront de plus en plus malades. Nous allons voir le taux de maladie mentale continuer à augmenter. Les déterminants sociaux de la mauvaise santé sont clairs, mais ce budget ne les aborde pas. I was speaking with a minimum wage earner in a senior's residence recently. She was telling me how difficult it is to pay for her groceries. The $1 increase in minimum wage on April 1st, she said, is nice, but it's not going to be enough to buy what's on her weekly grocery list while paying her rent and her transportation and meeting her other basic living expenses. We've got to abandon the language of minimum income, minimum wages, because it bears no relationship to the income needed to pay for the basics. The Employment Standards Act ensures employers pay at least a minimum for a wage, but that is meaningless, Madam Speaker. Minimum of what? The federal market basket measure says that a livable wage that just pays for the minimum basics of life in New Brunswick will be somewhere around $20 an hour now. Minimum wage is clearly far less than the minimum you need to live. So it's time, Madam Speaker, to introduce a basic livable income for all. We need to get on with that. Whatever it takes, this is the time. Starting with people with disabilities, establishing a pilot project in a corner, in a region of the province for everybody. Doing both. We just need to get on with it. Madam Speaker, with respect to education, the budget is going to provide an additional $2.4 million to support children with autism spectrum disorder, but it's silent on supporting children with an even more widespread neurological disability, and that's fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I don't understand how this can be. How were they left out? Why is this budget prejudiced against kids with FASD? The needs are great, and government's not stepping up. Instead, you know what? There's a new jail planned, and I can guarantee you a huge percentage of the people in that new jail will have FASD, undiagnosed FASD, unsupported FASD. That's why they end up in jail. It's a consequence of all too many people who suffer from FASD without adequate supports end up in jail. Bien que le budget prévoit $2 millions supplémentaires pour améliorer l'accès au programme alimentaire scolaire, il n'y a toujours pas d'engagement à fournir un programme alimentaire universel dans l'ensemble de notre système scolaire. Le budget accordera $3 millions aux municipalités nouvellement fusionnées pour qu'elles se présentent sous leurs nouveaux noms. Il faut faire beaucoup plus pour mettre fin à la faim chez les enfants de cette province. Madam Speaker, there's nothing more important than the education once your basic needs are met. But are the kids all right in our schools? I didn't see anything in the budget to address the special needs that all students face emerging from the pandemic. But major changes, all the same, are planned in the Anglophone sector this September with the high school renewal program. Kids need structure, kids need predictability and a sense of security. The rules are being changed again on them, Madam Speaker, and there's nothing in place to support them coming out of this pandemic. Madam Speaker, one of the nagging questions I have about this budget is why it doesn't address both systemic and overt racism. The Commission on Systemic Racism made important recommendations to which this government has yet to respond, and there's no mention in the budget of it at all. One of the most important recommendations, to establish a body of government to oversee the dismantling of systemic racism in government, not a mention. Which brings me to First Nations, Madam Speaker, our treaty partners. The budget forecasts $43.6 million less in revenue for the people in this province with the poorest postal codes in Canada. Shameful. The colonialism of the past persists to this present day. The sheer paternalism expressed by this government towards Indigenous people is a throwback to the era when they couldn't leave their communities without a pass from the Indian Age in the 1950s. Shameful. There are important matters to negotiate with our treaty partners, not the least of which is how to share the Crown land. The budget is silent on any initiatives to build an actual relationship with our treaty partners, never mind dismantling the overt racism experienced in workplaces that fall under the provincial government's responsibility. Une fois de plus, ce gouvernement n'a pas saisi l'occasion d'investir dans des solutions à nos nombreux défis, malgré des accidents successifs qui s'élèvent à près de 2 milliards de dollars. Au lieu de cela, il saupoudre de l'argent ici et là pour faire croire qu'il résout les problèmes, alors qu'il ne fait que les recouvrir d'un pansement. Madam Speaker, this budget is the wrong budget for our times. There was every opportunity to bring forward the right budget. Government had the money, but it didn't have the will, and it will not get my support as a result. Thank you, Madam Speaker.